Okay, I want to start our next demo. What I want to demonstrate to you initially here is how to create an application that has a static table view. In other words, the data is fixed. It's not going to vary dynamically. So this might be a common approach if you had a settings screen or something along the lines of that. So I'm going to start Xcode and create a new project. And I'm going to start with a single view application. So we'll create something from scratch here, and I'll call this my static table view demo. And put it in the right place. Okay, and the very first thing I'm going to do here is create a brand new view controller, because I want something that's derived from UI table view controller. The one that got created by default here is just generic UI view controller. But when I control a table view, I want to use a UI table view controller. So let me just stretch things out so we got some space. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new UI table view controller. So I'm going to select iOS and then go, and I'm going to, this is a Cocoa Touch class. So I'm going to select that, and now I'll get a dialog, and I'm going to call this my table view controller, and it's going to extend UI table view controller. And I'll take the defaults on the rest, click next, add it to the project, and you'll notice that it generates a bunch of stubbed out code, and in fact it generates these functions. These are actually from my data source delegate here, and I'm going to just comment these out entirely because it's going to be a static table view, and so I'm going to actually specify the rows and sections right in Interface Builder. So for now I'm going to just comment this stuff out, and when we do a dynamic one we'll actually come back and use these. So the next thing, I need to go into my Interface Builder and go ahead and create a table view controller there. So we'll go down here, and you'll notice in my object library here there is a table view controller. So I'm going to drag this out, and I'm going to take this little arrow here, which is my indicating the initial view controller when the app runs, and I'm going to add it right there. And then I'm going to just go ahead and delete this original one and delete this original file. Alright, so this guy here is now going to run, and the first thing I need to do is associate this object in my Interface Builder with that class that I just implemented. So to do that, I need to go over here to the Identity Inspector, and I need to type in the name of that class, that custom class. So by doing that, I've now associated this particular view controller in the Interface Builder with the source code over there. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this. By default, this thing is set up to be dynamic, but I'm going to change it so that it's static. And one way to manipulate objects in your view hierarchy, over here in the lower left you'll see this document outline option. Now if I turn this in, it gives me a nice kind of outline of all the different things inside here. And so if I select options here, I can actually select the different components. So if I go over to my table view controller, actually the table view, So if I select the table view, so this is the view that the controller is managing, and I go to the attributes inspector, you'll notice at the top there it says dynamic prototypes. Okay, so it's set up by default to be dynamic because that's the most common. So I'm going to switch that and say static cell. And just for fun, I'm going to have two sections. So there's my two sections. And I can go over here and edit these. So I'm going to call these section 0. And I'll have 3 rows in that section. And I can also put a footer on here. Okay, as soon as I do that, that happens, and I'll do the same thing over here. I'll call this section 1, footer 1, and I think I'm going to go down to 2 rows in each of these. Alright, and inside my table cells I've got a nested view here, just kind of a small canvas, and I can drag stuff out there on that. And so I'm going to put a label on each of those rows so I can distinguish them. So I'll just drag a label up here, put it like that, and then I'll give it a name. Say this is row 0. Maybe move it over a little bit, and then I'll copy that. And this one's row 1. Copy again. Row 0. And then I'll copy this one. Alright. And so there I've got a static table. That could be any text. I could put images on. I could do anything I want there. And if we run this, okay, sure enough, it does exactly what you might have thought. But there's nothing really going on here. I really can't interact with it. So let's, I shouldn't have deleted that other view. let's set up a segue here. Let's set up a segue so that we can have this thing actually transition to another view controller and display the detail. Now, there's a couple ways we can get this view controller under the management of a navigation controller. The technique that I mentioned in the lecture notes is to simply go down here, find the navigation controller right here, and just drag it out here to the canvas. And by default, you'll see that it pulled out this. Let me get this out of here so you can see it better. Okay, by default, when you do this, it automatically grabs a view controller with a table view in it, because that's like so common. But we don't want this one. We have our own, so I'm going to delete this. And I'm going to take the start segue here and push this over here, because I want the nav controller to be first. Then I select the nav controller, control click, drag over to here, and on this pop-up I'm going to set a relationship segue. I'm going to make it my root view. When I do that, I've now placed this table view under the controller as a subordinate or child of this nav controller. And you'll notice that right away it's got this nav bar on there. Okay, if I select this, I could give it a title. Say static table. Okay, so there's my title, and if I run this, you'll actually see at this point I've got the nav bar. Okay, so there's my nav bar. There's nothing on it right now because I haven't activated anything on it. Let's go back now and set up a segue. So when we click on one of these rows, we'd like to segue to a detail, and we'd like to tell that destination controller what data it's going to operate on. Okay, that was what we talked about. Source view controller tells destination view controller what it has to do. So the first thing I'm going to do is go in and turn on these disclosure indicators on each of my cells. So if I go to my table view cell, under accessory I can put disclosure indicator. And I'll do that for each one of these. And sometimes if it's hard to select something in the visual part of it, you can just go over to that document outline and it's much easier to find something there. And the next thing I want to do is add another view controller out here. And what I want to have is anytime I click on one of these rows, I want a transition or a segue to occur to bring me to this detailed view controller. But I'm going to use the same view controller for every row. I'm just going to tell it what its content is going to be right before it segues. So to set these up, you select the row that you're interested in. And once again, if you can't get it visually, you can grab it this way. So now I've selected, and I'm going to control click, drag over and point at the controller that I want to segue to, release, and we're going to do a show segue. All right, now in the past we would do a push here as a first, but because now in iOS 8 it knows that a show segue in the context of a nav controller is automatically going to be translated as a push. Now if I select that segue, I can go in here and I can put an identifier on it. So just for kicks, I'm going to give an identifier that's kind of descriptive of what that row is. This was section 0, row 0. So I just set that on the segue. Now what I want to have happen is when I click on this row, I want to segue over here, and then I want to display text on what row I actually selected. So kind of simulate details. Before I do that, let me just run this and make sure it works. So if I click here, notice what it did. It did the segue. Now it's blank. There's nothing there. But notice what I got it here in the upper left. I've got my back button automatic. And the text on it is set to the title of the previous. So if I click this, I'm back in there. Okay. Now I need to do this for every one of these rows though. And since this is static, I'm just going to wire these up manually. So let me go to row 1. And we'll do a show. And this one was section 0, row 1. And we'll do the next one. What's that? Now I am. So there's section 1, row 0, and then one more. Section 1, row 1. Now if I run, and I pick any of these, they all segue. Okay? But now I want to get something up on the screen. How do I do that? Well, first of all, I have to put a view hierarchy out here in this other controller. Right? So what I'm going to do is just put a simple label out there. I'll just put a label out here, kind of center it, make it big enough. And what I'll do is I'll set up a property or a model that takes a string, and then when this thing loads, I'll load that string. So I need to create a view controller class to be able to implement that kind of behavior and associate it with this view controller. So I'm going to come back over here and say File New, and this is going to be a UI view controller. So this will be my detail view controller, and it implements UI view controller. We add it to the project, and there it is. And then what I need to do is go into the storyboard, select this class, and go over to the identity inspector and type in the name of that custom class. So it was called my detail. Am I in the right? No, I've got the label selected, sorry. That's the one I want. My detail. There. Then I can wire up a outlet so I can be able to set this thing. So notice it's contextually intelligent. So now that this is selected, when I click my when I go into the assistant editor, it automatically picks the right source code here, and this is set to automatic up here. Okay, if it didn't find it automatic, we could drop off and go to manual and go find it. Okay, but in this case, it figured it out for me. So I'll go up here and add an outlet. We'll call this detail label. So there's my outlet, and then I also want to set a property on this guy. So we'll say var my string of type string, and we'll set that as an optional. And now what we need to do is we need to have the source controller set up the destination view controller. So when I select something that's going to cause a segue, I need to somehow do some work so that that destination view controller knows the data it's going to operate on. And I'm going to do that by implementing a framework hook function. So if we go over to that table view controller, you'll see stubbed off at the very bottom is a function called prepare for segue. So I'm going to uncomment this function. And anytime you do a segue, this function is going to get called automatically. And we're past a segue object. And we can ask the segue object, what's your destination? And we know that that destination is going to be of type my detail view controller. So the destination, we'll call it dest controller of type that. And we can then ask it. So we'll ask the segue. So we'll say segue. Let me go back to the editor view here so we got some room. So we'll say segue.destination view controller, but notice it's coming back as this nebulous class any object, because there could be lots of different types of objects here. So I need to kind of take this thing and coerce it into the type of object that I want it to be. So I'm gonna do this by accessing this property, and I can say as, and it's my detail view controller. Okay, so this gets me a reference to the target or the destination view controller. This is where we're going momentarily. And what I want to do now is I want to set that string property on that destination so that when it loads, it knows what to put up on the screen on that label. So we can say dest controller dot myString equals, and what is the string? Well, remember I've put this descriptive string on the segue identifier, so I'm going to kind of cheat and use that. But normally we'd have some type of model here where we'd be plucking that data out of. So I can say segue dot identifier. Alright, the last thing I need to do is go back into my detail view, and on the load here, on the load we're going to need to set that outlet's text. So what we're going to say is the self.detail labels text is equal to self.myString. Alright, now if we did everything right, when it runs, it now displays the appropriate data.